Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The bitter cold that swept across the northern European plain brought more than just frost to the ground on that winter morning in 1127. As the crowd gathered in the muddy field outside Ypres, their breath hanging like ghostly apparitions in the frigid air, they came to witness justice served in the oldest and most visceral manner known to their kind, through combat, blood, and if God willed it, death. Two men stood at opposite ends of a roughly circular area marked by wooden stakes. The older man, Guy of Steenvoorde, a weathered knight of 50 winters, flexed his gauntleted hands around the grip of his sword. Across from him, the younger Herman of Valenciennes, barely into his third decade, whispered prayers to himself as he adjusted his shield. Between them lay not just 20 paces of trampled earth, but an accusation of murder that could only be resolved through steel and courage. God reveals truth through combat, intoned the presiding cleric, his voice carrying across the hushed assembly. May he strengthen the arm of the righteous and bring low the guilty. The origins of such scenes stretch back into the mists of Germanic tribal custom, where the belief that divine will manifested through physical confrontation became deeply embedded in the culture. Unlike the sophisticated legal systems of Roman law, or the meticulous regulations of canonical procedure, the Germanic peoples developed a system of justice that, in cases where evidence was lacking or contradictory, placed the ultimate decision in the hands of physical prowess and, by extension, divine intervention. The earliest documented instance of regulated judicial combat appears in the Burgundian Code of King Gundobad in AD 502. This code specified that when oaths and testimony proved insufficient to resolve a dispute, the parties could resort to armed confrontation to determine the truth. The underlying principle was clear. God would not allow the innocent to be defeated, for he would strengthen the arm of the righteous and sap the strength of the wicked. When the party to whom the oath has been offered does not wish to receive it, but says that his adversary's pledge of truth can be proven by arms, and the other party will not give up, let permission for combat not be denied, the ancient Burgundian decree stated, laying the foundation for centuries of blood-soaked justice. As Guy and Herman circled each other in that field near Ypres, they were participating in a tradition that had, by the 12th century, become firmly established across much of Western Europe. The practice was, as medievalist Eric Jaeger noted, almost universal in Europe during the medieval period, though it manifested differently according to regional customs and legal frameworks. From these Burgundian roots, the practice spread throughout the Frankish Empire, and later the Holy Roman Empire. By the 8th century, trial by combat was sufficiently established that Charlemagne's capitularies from 803 onward included regulations governing its use. These early regulations demonstrated an attempt to systematize what had previously been a more informal custom, reflecting the growing complexity of medieval governance. In Scandinavia, the practice took the form of the holmgang, a ritualized duel fought on a small island or designated piece of land, often with precisely defined boundaries. The Norse sagas record numerous such combats, where men fought not only to resolve accusations, but also to settle property disputes and questions of honor. Strike then if you dare, for I have not moved from your marks, says Egil in the famous saga bearing his name, standing firmly within the boundaries set for their holmgang. Your challenge is answered with my presence. Now let Odin judge between us. The spread of Christianity might have been expected to diminish such practices, given the Church's general opposition to violence outside of sanctioned warfare. Yet remarkably, the Church found ways to accommodate the deeply ingrained custom of trial by combat, integrating it into a Christian framework by recasting it as a means by which God could manifest his judgment. The Church's uneasy relationship with judicial combat would persist throughout the medieval period, with clerics simultaneously condemning the practice while participating in its rituals. As Guy and Herman began their deadly dance in that field near Ypres, they enacted a drama with roots stretching back 6 centuries, one that would continue to evolve through the next 400 years. Their swords caught the winter sunlight as they clashed, each man fighting not just for his life, but for divine vindication. For the assembled crowd, this was not mere violence, but the visible manifestation of divine justice, where truth would emerge from the crucible of combat. The duel lasted nearly an hour, a grueling testament to both men's endurance. When Herman finally fell, blood pouring from a wound to his neck, the crowd did not see a simple killing, but the revelation of God's judgment. Guy had been vindicated, the accusation against him proven false through the only means this society fully trusted, the judgment of combat. As Guy knelt to pray, his bloodied sword thrust into the earth beside Herman's cooling body, he participated in a tradition that would continue to evolve through the coming centuries, changing from a primarily judicial process to one increasingly concerned with personal honor and social standing. The seeds of the gentlemanly duel of later centuries were already present in these early judicial combats, where courage, skill, and divine favor intertwined to create a spectacle both brutal and, to medieval eyes, beautiful in its clarity. The light filtering through the stained glass of Reims Cathedral cast a kaleidoscope of colors across the face of Philippe de Beaucencourt as he knelt before the altar on the eve of his combat. The year was 1215, and tomorrow he would face Raoul d'Arras in a duel that would determine not just his fate, but that of his entire family. Accused of stealing relics from the cathedral treasury, Philippe had demanded trial by combat when witness testimony proved contradictory. "Grant me strength, Lord, if I be innocent," he whispered, his calloused hands clasped tightly in prayer. "Let your judgment shine through my arm tomorrow." The priest who attended him placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember, my son, that God sees into the hearts of men. If you speak truth, he will not abandon you to defeat." This profound belief in divine intervention formed the theological underpinning of judicial combat throughout the medieval period. Trial by combat was categorized as an ordeal, a judicium Dei, or judgment of God, alongside other forms such as trial by fire or water. What united these disparate practices was the conviction that God would reveal truth by protecting the innocent and punishing the guilty. Medieval people often cited the biblical story of David and Goliath as a precedent for judicial combat. In this narrative, God worked a miracle, allowing the righteous but physically inferior David to triumph over the mighty Goliath. This story provided a powerful template for understanding how divine justice could manifest through combat. God would strengthen the arm of the righteous, regardless of apparent physical disparities. As our Lord God gave victory to David over Goliath, so shall he grant triumph to those who stand in truth, declared the Bishop of Laon in 1208, blessing the weapons of 2 combatants before their duel. The Church's relationship with judicial combat was complex and often contradictory. While many clerics expressed theological reservations about the practice, arguing that it tempted God to perform miracles on demand, the Church nevertheless developed elaborate rituals to sanctify these proceedings. The Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 prohibited clergy from participating in ordeals that involved bloodshed, yet the practice continued with ecclesiastical blessing in many regions. Before a judicial combat, both participants would typically attend Mass, make confession, and receive the Eucharist. Their weapons would be blessed, and they would swear solemn oaths on relics or holy books, affirming the justice of their cause and denying the use of any magical advantages. These rituals transformed what might otherwise be mere violence into a sacred process. I swear by the Holy Gospels and by the true cross that my cause is just, that I have used no sorcery, no herb of virtue, no charm or talisman, and that I place my trust solely in God, my own body, and my righteous cause," intoned Philippe before the gathered witnesses on the morning of his combat. The theological underpinnings of trial by combat reflected a worldview fundamentally different from modern legal thinking. Where contemporary jurisprudence seeks empirical evidence and logical deduction, medieval justice often grappled with cases where evidence was impossible to obtain or verify. In such circumstances, appealing to divine judgment through combat provided a resolution that aligned with their understanding of God's active role in human affairs. This is not to suggest that medieval people were naive or uncritical about the process. Contemporary chronicles record numerous instances where observers questioned whether the outcome truly reflected divine will. When Robert de Montfort defeated Henry of Essex in a judicial duel in 1163, chroniclers noted that many believed Essex had been overcome more by the weight of his guilty conscience than by divine intervention, a subtle but significant distinction that suggests a degree of skepticism about the theological premise. As Philippe faced Raoul on that spring morning in 1215, the assembled crowd watched not merely as spectators to violence, but as witnesses to divine revelation. The combat lasted for hours, both men skilled and determined. When Philippe finally drove Raoul to his knees with a powerful blow to the helm, forcing a surrender, the crowd's reaction was not simply appreciation of martial skill, but awe at the manifestation of God's judgment. "God has spoken through his arm," murmured the cathedral deacon, making the sign of the cross as Raoul was led away in disgrace. The consequences for Raoul were severe. As the defeated party in a judicial combat, he was considered not merely to have lost a fight, but to have been proven guilty by divine verdict. He was hanged the following day, his property confiscated, and his name disgraced. For medieval observers, this harsh punishment was not excessive but appropriate, the earthly execution of a judgment already rendered by God. Not all judicial combats ended in death. In less serious cases, a combat might conclude when one party was driven from the field or admitted defeat. The practice varied widely across regions and time periods, reflecting the piecemeal development of medieval legal systems. In some jurisdictions, a defeated party might be allowed to recant their testimony or pay compensation rather than face execution. The belief in divine judgment through combat began to wane as legal systems grew more sophisticated and as theological critiques of the practice gained influence. By the late 13th century, many regions had significantly restricted the circumstances under which judicial combat could be employed. The French King Louis IX, St. Louis, banned judicial combat altogether in 1258 as part of his judicial reforms, though the practice continued in some regions despite royal prohibition. Nevertheless, the concept of combat as a means of revealing truth persisted in modified forms. Even as judicial duels became less common, the idea that courage in combat reflected moral virtue remained powerful. The chivalric duel of honor, which would become increasingly prominent in later centuries, retained echoes of this earlier belief in the revelatory power of combat. though with emphasis shifting from divine judgment to the defense of personal honor. As Philippe de Beaucencourt left the field of combat that day in Reims, vindicated by his victory, he participated in a tradition that balanced on the cusp of significant change. The society that had gathered to witness God's judgment through his sword arm would, over the coming centuries, gradually develop alternative means of resolving disputes. Yet, the powerful image of combat as truth-revealing would continue to resonate through European culture long after judicial duels had faded from legal practice. The hall fell silent as the herald unrolled the parchment, the royal seal of England dangling from its bottom edge. It was June 1384, and the court had gathered to hear the regulations that would govern the upcoming judicial combat between Sir Thomas Carrington and Lord William Weston. The dispute, concerning accusations of treason during the recent campaign in Flanders, had reached an impasse that only blood could resolve. Hear ye, the herald began, his voice resonating through the vaulted chamber. By order of His Majesty King Richard II, the following rules shall govern the trial by combat to be held 3 days hence between Sir Thomas Carrington, plaintiff, and Lord William Weston, defendant. What followed was a detailed recitation of regulations covering everything from the dimensions of the combat area to the specific weapons permitted, from the oaths to be sworn to the signals that would initiate and conclude the deadly encounter. These were not arbitrary restrictions, but the culmination of centuries of evolving custom, a complex framework designed to transform potentially chaotic violence into a regulated procedure. The codification of combat rules represented one of the most significant developments in the evolution of medieval dueling. What had begun as relatively informal encounters governed primarily by local custom gradually developed into highly structured events with extensive written regulations. This process reflected broader trends in medieval governance, as societies increasingly sought to regulate violence and channel it into forms that reinforced rather than threatened social order. Among the earliest detailed regulations were those found in the Lex Alima Minorum from the early 8th century, which prescribed specific procedures for duels concerning land disputes. By the 12th century, more elaborate codes had emerged, with works such as Philippe de Beaumanoir's Coutumes de Beauvaisis, providing extensive guidance on the proper conduct of judicial combats in northern France. The regulations typically addressed several key areas: who could participate in judicial combat, under what circumstances it could be employed, what weapons and armor were permitted, and what consequences would follow for the defeated party. These rules varied significantly across regions and evolved over time, reflecting local legal traditions and changing attitudes toward violence. Eligibility for combat was a primary concern. In principle, judicial combat was available to all free men, though with important qualifications. Women, clergy, the elderly, the disabled, and children were generally exempted, though they could appoint champions to fight on their behalf. This practice of using champions gradually expanded, particularly in civil cases, allowing specialized combatants to represent parties who could not or preferred not to fight themselves. No man above 60 winters shall be compelled to wage battle in his own person, stated the Assize of Northampton in 1176, but he may appoint a champion if the case demands combat. Social status significantly influenced combat regulations. When disputes crossed social boundaries, rules were adjusted to prevent unfair advantages. As Philippe de Beaumanoir noted in the 13th century, a knight challenging a commoner would be required to fight with the same weapons and armor as his opponent, rather than enjoying the superior equipment his rank might otherwise afford him. This principle of relative equality in equipment, while not eliminating all advantages of training and experience, represented an attempt to ensure that combat reflected divine judgment rather than merely social privilege. The permitted weapons and armor varied according to the nature of the case and the status of the combatants. In the most serious cases, such as accusations of treason or murder, combatants typically fought with lethal weapons, swords, shields, and in full armor. For lesser offenses, more restrictive equipment might be prescribed, such as wooden batons or shields alone. Some regulations specified extraordinarily detailed requirements for equipment, down to the precise dimensions of shields or the materials from which weapons could be crafted. The shields shall be of wood covered with leather, no larger than 3 feet in length and 2 feet in width, specified the regulations for a combat in Augsburg in 1409. The swords shall be of equal length, not exceeding 3 1/2 feet from pommel to point, and shall be inspected by the king's armorer before the combat. The combat area itself was subject to detailed regulation. Many judicial combats took place in specially constructed enclosed spaces, often circular or square, marked by stakes or ropes. These defined boundaries served both practical and symbolic purposes, creating a controlled environment for the fight, while also representing the sacred nature of the space where divine judgment would manifest. Before combat could begin, elaborate preliminary rituals had to be observed. Both parties would swear solemn oaths affirming the justice of their cause and denying the use of any magical advantages. These oaths were not mere formalities, but serious religious undertakings, with perjury considered a grave sin that would surely result in defeat, if not divine punishment, beyond the combat itself. "I swear by Almighty God and His saints that my cause is just and true," Lord William Weston declared, kneeling before the altar on the morning of his combat with Sir Thomas. "I carry no charm, no herb of virtue, no magical device, but trust only in God, my right arm, and the justice of my cause." The beginning and end of combat were marked by formal signals, often the dropping of a baton or the sounding of a trumpet. Combat continued until one party was killed, rendered unable to continue, driven from the field, or admitted defeat by crying, "Craven," an admission of cowardice that carried lasting shame. In some regions, combat would also end if fighting continued until nightfall without a clear victor, though the implications of such an inconclusive result varied. The consequences of defeat were severe and varied according to the nature of the case. In criminal matters, the defeated party, whether plaintiff or defendant, might face execution, mutilation, or imprisonment. In civil disputes concerning property, defeat typically meant the loss of the contested property and often additional penalties for bringing a false claim or defense. And should either party be vanquished, continued the herald reading the regulations for the Carrington-Weston duel, "He shall be drawn to the common gallows, and there hanged as a traitor to the crown, his property forfeit to his majesty, and his name and honors extinguished for all time." These elaborate regulations reflect the medieval attempt to reconcile two seemingly contradictory principles: the belief that combat revealed divine truth, and the recognition that human conflicts required ordered procedures. By embedding violence within a framework of rules, medieval society transformed potentially disruptive conflicts into ritualized performances that reinforced, rather than threatened, social order. As Sir Thomas and Lord William prepared for their encounter, each surrounded by attendants, helping them don armor and check weapons, they participated in a tradition that had evolved from relatively informal tribal customs into a sophisticated legal procedure. The combat that would follow, witnessed by the king himself and hundreds of spectators, would be not merely a physical contest, but the culmination of a complex social and legal process designed to resolve what other methods of adjudication could not. 3 days later, when Sir Thomas's sword found the gap between Lord William's helmet and breastplate, ending the combat with a spray of arterial blood, the assembled crowd did not see merely a killing, but the conclusion of a regulated process. Lord William's body, once removed from the field, would be dragged to the gallows and hanged as specified in the regulations, a final, grim confirmation that even in death, he remained subject to the rules that had governed their encounter. The armorer's workshop in Toledo hummed with purposeful activity as Master Rodrigo examined the sword that would, in 3 weeks' time, determine whether Don Alfonso de Vargas lived or died. The year was 1432, and Don Alfonso faced a judicial duel against Don Pedro Manrique over accusations of betrayal during the recent campaign against Granada. The choice of weapon had fallen to Don Pedro, as was customary for the defendant, and he had selected the sword and small shield, a combination that would require skill rather than mere strength to wield effectively. "The balance is perfect," Master Rodrigo murmured, testing the sword's weight with practiced hands. "Sharp enough to part mail, but not so thin as to break against a solid defense. This blade will serve you well, Don Alfonso, if your cause be just." The evolution of dueling weapons reflected not just technological developments in metallurgy and arms manufacturing, but also changing conceptions of how combat should reveal truth or defend honor. From the relatively simple weapons of early medieval judicial combats to the specialized dueling arms of the 15th century, this evolution tracked broader changes in warfare, social organization, and legal thinking. In the earliest judicial combats documented in Germanic legal codes, weapons were relatively basic, often the same arms a man might carry to war or use for personal defense. Swords, spears, shields, and occasionally axes formed the primary arsenal for these early encounters. The emphasis was not on specialized equipment, but on the divine judgment believed to manifest through combat with familiar weapons. "Let them fight with their war gear, as becomes free men," specified the 8th century Lex Alamanorum, with shield and spear, or with sword if they so choose. By the 12th century, as judicial combat became more formalized, greater attention was paid to ensuring that weapons were appropriate to the status of the combatants and the nature of the dispute. Civil cases often prescribed less lethal weapons than criminal matters, reflecting a proportional approach to violence. Commoners might fight with wooden batons or cudgels, while knights and nobles typically employed swords, the quintessential symbol of their martial status. The choice of weapons became increasingly significant as judicial combat evolved. By the 13th century, many legal codes specified that the defendant had the right to select the weapons, a privilege that could confer substantial advantage. This right was balanced against requirements that weapons be equal in quality and dimension, with both sets often inspected before combat to prevent cheating through superior equipment. "The defendant shall choose the weapons," stated the regulations for a judicial combat in Paris in 1386, "but they shall be of equal quality and measure, and shall be examined by the king's armorer 3 days before the appointed time." As armor improved through the medieval period, weapons evolved to counter these defensive advancements. The rise of plate armor in the 14th and 15th centuries led to the development of specialized weapons designed to overcome these formidable defenses. In judicial combats between fully armored opponents, weapons such as the poleaxe, a versatile staff weapon combining axe, hammer, and spear point, became increasingly common, allowing combatants to strike with crushing force, or target the vulnerable gaps between armor plates. The sword, however, retained its symbolic importance, even as its practical effectiveness against plate armor diminished. As the emblematic weapon of the knightly class, the sword carried connotations of justice and authority that made it particularly appropriate for judicial combat. Specialized sword forms developed for armored combat, featuring stiffer blades, more acute points for thrusting at armor joints, and often a grip, allowing the use of two hands for greater power. The sword shall be of battle quality, instructed the regulations for a combat in Nuremberg in 1409. With a blade no longer than 42 inches, a cruciform hilt suitable for both single and double-handed use, and a point shaped to seek the joints of armor. For unarmored or lightly armored combats, different weapons predominated. The arming sword and buckler, a small shield, combination offered mobility and defensive capability, while longswords provided reach and striking power. In regions where judicial combat persisted among commoners, simpler weapons such as cudgels, staves, or agricultural implements modified for combat might be prescribed. Regional variations in preferred weapons were significant. In parts of Germany, the Kolben, a specialized wooden club shaped somewhat like a bowling pin, became the standard weapon for judicial combats among certain classes by the 15th century. In Italy, where sophisticated fencing traditions developed earlier than in Northern Europe, the sword and dagger combination gained prominence, requiring and showcasing technical skill rather than mere strength. Beyond the primary weapons, auxiliary arms played important roles in many judicial combats. Daggers served as secondary weapons, vital when combat moved to close quarters or if the primary weapon was lost or broken. Small shields, such as bucklers, provided defensive capabilities while allowing offensive action, particularly important in unarmored combats where a single solid blow could prove decisive. As judicial combat evolved into the duel of honor in the later medieval and early Renaissance periods, weapons changed accordingly. The emphasis shifted from weapons of war to specialized dueling arms, designed specifically for single combat between individuals rather than battlefield use. This transition reflected the changing nature of the duel itself, from a method of legal proof to a means of defending personal honor. By the late 15th century, specialized fencing schools had emerged in many European cities, teaching techniques specifically for judicial combat and duels of honor. Masters such as Hans Talhofer produced illustrated manuals detailing weapon use in judicial duels, including unusual scenarios such as combats between men and women, where the man was typically handicapped by standing in a pit or having one arm bound. When a woman accuses a man and combat is ordered, wrote Talhofer in his 1459 Fechtbuch, the man shall stand waist-deep in a pit with a club, while the woman remains free to move about him with her stone and a cloth. The psychological impact of weapon selection cannot be overlooked. When Don Pedro Manrique chose the sword and small shield for his combat with Don Alfonso, he selected not just physical implements, but psychological tools. Don Alfonso, known to favor the heavier poleaxe, would now face a contest requiring the very finesse and agility in which Don Pedro excelled. This strategic selection of weapons added layers of psychological pressure to an already daunting ordeal. As Don Alfonso watched Master Rodrigo make final adjustments to the sword that would determine his fate, he contemplated the weapon not merely as a tool of violence, but as an instrument of divine judgment and social validation. The sword that would defend his honor and potentially take the life of Don Pedro was more than shaped metal. It was the physical manifestation of a complex social and legal tradition, the means by which truth would be revealed and justice served. 3 weeks later, When the two men faced each other in the Plaza Mayor of Toledo, their weapons gleamed in the Spanish sun. Not just implements of violence, but symbols of a system where combat could transform disputed claims into established truth, where steel could determine destinies, and where the arsenal of honor served as the ultimate arbiter when all other methods failed. Sir Geoffrey Luttrell adjusted the weight of his great helm, the sound of his breathing echoing within the enclosed steel. Through the narrow eye slits, he could see his opponent across the tilt-yard, similarly encased in plates of hardened steel. The year was 1327, and this judicial combat to resolve accusations of treachery during Edward II's disastrous Scottish campaign would be fought in the most sophisticated armor available in England. "Remember your training," murmured Sir Geoffrey's squire, making a final adjustment to the breastplate. "The armor protects the body, but only God protects the soul." The evolution of armor in medieval judicial combats reflected not just technological developments in metallurgy and craftsmanship, but also changing conceptions of how combat should be conducted. From the relatively simple protection of the early medieval period to the elaborate plate harnesses of the 15th century, this evolution tracked broader changes in warfare, social status, and the ritualization of violence. In the earliest documented judicial combats, protection typically consisted of whatever armor the combatant might wear to war. Often mail hauberks, shirts of interlocked metal rings, simple helmets, and shields. These provided reasonable protection against cutting blows while allowing mobility, striking a balance between defense and the need for a decisive outcome. "They shall come to the field armored as for war," stated an early 11th century account of a judicial combat in Normandy, with hauberk, helm, and shield, but no more than this, that God's judgment be not impeded by excessive protection. As judicial combat became more formalized in the 12th and 13th centuries, regulations increasingly specified what armor was permitted, reflecting concerns about fairness and the proper conduct of these encounters. These regulations often varied according to the social status of the combatants and the nature of the accusation, with more serious charges typically allowing more substantial protection. The evolution of armor technology significantly influenced judicial combat. The gradual transition from mail to plate armor during the 13th and 14th centuries transformed not just the appearance of combatants, but the very nature of their encounters. Early plate elements, knee and elbow cops, breastplates, and more enclosed helmets, supplemented rather than replaced mail, creating transitional, mixed armors that offered enhanced protection at vulnerable points. By the late 14th century, full plate harnesses had emerged for those who could afford them, encasing combatants in articulated steel shells custom-fitted to their bodies. These sophisticated armors, far from being the unwieldy metal coffins of popular imagination, were carefully engineered to distribute weight and allow remarkable mobility. A well-made harness weighed typically between 45 to 55 pounds, with the weight distributed across the body rather than concentrated, allowing trained knights to run, mount horses unaided, and fight for extended periods. "The armor shall be of plate throughout," specified the regulations for a judicial combat in Paris in 1386, with articulated joints at shoulders, elbows, hips, and knees, and a great helm secured by chain to the breastplate, all pieces to be inspected 3 days before combat to ensure neither advantage nor peril from poor craftsmanship. For judicial combats between fully armored opponents, victory often required either exhausting the opponent or exploiting the vulnerabilities that even the finest armor possessed. Specialized techniques developed to target the gaps between plates, the armpit, the inside of the elbow, the back of the knee, and particularly the vision slits of the helmet. Weapons evolved accordingly, with more acute points designed to pierce these gaps, and hammers or maces capable of delivering concussive force through plate. Not all judicial combats involve such elaborate protection. For lesser cases or combats between commoners, simpler forms of armor prevailed. Leather reinforced with metal, quilted gambesons, and partial plate elements combined with mail created a spectrum of protection appropriate to different social classes and types of cases. In some instances, particularly for minor offenses, regulations might specify minimal armor or even its absence entirely, allowing for a swifter and more decisive resolution. For cases not touching on felony or treason, stated a 14th century English legal text, combatants shall wear no more than quilted jacks and open bassinets, that the matter be resolved with godly swiftness, rather than prolonged by excessive harness. The psychological impact of armor in judicial combat was profound. The transformation of the human form into an articulated steel shell created a dehumanizing effect, reducing individuals to anonymous metal figures. The great helm, in particular, with its complete enclosure of the head and face, created a psychological barrier between combatants, perhaps making it easier to inflict potentially lethal violence upon another human being. Yet armor also created a profound intimacy in combat. To defeat an armored opponent required close quarters engagement, exploiting vulnerabilities through precisely targeted strikes or wrestling techniques that could throw an opponent to the ground, where the weight of armor became a deadly disadvantage. Judicial combats between armored opponents often concluded not with dramatic sword strokes, but with grueling grappling on the ground, one combatant pinning the other and driving a dagger through a vulnerable point. For spectators, the visual impact of armored combat carried powerful symbolic resonance. The transformation of men into gleaming metal figures embodied the ritualization of violence, converting potentially chaotic aggression into a highly formalized spectacle. The anonymity conferred by enclosed helmets reinforced the sense that these were not merely individuals in conflict, but representatives of abstract principles, innocence and guilt, truth and falsehood, embodied in human form. Regional variations in armor traditions influenced the character of judicial combats throughout Europe. Italian armors typically favored mobility over maximum protection, reflecting a combat style that emphasized agility and technique. German traditions often featured more robust protection, particularly for the head and torso, while English and French styles represented a middle ground between these approaches. The economic aspects of armor in judicial combat cannot be overlooked. Full-plate harnesses represented enormous investments, requiring hundreds of hours of skilled labor and substantial quantities of high-quality materials. This economic reality reinforced social distinctions in judicial combat, with elaborate armors serving as visible manifestations of status and wealth. For combatants of lesser means, borrowed or inherited armor might literally determine life or death, with ill-fitting protection creating dangerous vulnerabilities. The defendant appeared in a breastplate too large for his frame, noted a chronicle describing a combat in Ghent in 1425, and when he raised his arm to strike, the gap thus created beneath his armpit admitted his opponent's blade to his heart. As Sir Geoffrey Luttrell and his opponent advanced toward each other on that spring day in 1327, their armored forms caught the sunlight, transforming them into gleaming sculptures of articulated steel. For the assembled spectators, this metamorphosis from men into armored combatants represented the elevation of their conflict from mere violence to ritualized judgment. The armor that encased them served not just to protect their bodies but to symbolize the gravity of the occasion. a moment when personal dispute had been transformed into a matter of divine judgment and social consequence. Hours later, when Sir Geoffrey finally drove his opponent to surrender, after a grueling contest that moved from mounted lances to dismounted swordplay to exhausting ground combat, his victory was attributed not just to his skill and endurance, but to the divine judgment that had manifested through the ordeal. As his squires helped remove his dented, blood-smeared armor, revealing the bruised and sweat-soaked man within, Sir Geoffrey transitioned back from symbolic combatant to mortal knight, his innocence now established through the language of steel and the grammar of combat. The wooden practice sword whistled through the morning air, meeting its twin with a sharp crack that echoed across the courtyard. Jean de Metz, a knight of 35 winters, pushed his young opponent back with a series of measured strikes, then suddenly shifted his weight and swept the youth's legs from under him. The young man, Guillaume, nephew to the Count of Foix, hit the packed earth with a grunt, his practice sword flying from his grip. "You're dead," Jean said matter-of-factly, the point of his wooden sword at Guillaume's throat. "Again. I thought I had you that time," Guillaume protested, accepting Jean's outstretched hand to regain his feet. "You thought," Jean replied, emphasizing the word. "In 3 weeks, when you face young Savary in judicial combat, thinking will get you killed. Your body must know what to do when your mind is clouded by fear." The scene in this Aquitanian courtyard in 1378 reflected a reality often overlooked in discussions of medieval judicial combat: the intensive training required to survive such encounters. Behind every judicial duel lay months or years of preparation, a process that shaped not just physical capabilities but psychological readiness for an ordeal where failure often meant death. Training for judicial combat evolved considerably through the medieval period. In the earlier centuries, when such encounters were primarily extensions of warfare, training differed little from general martial preparation. Knights and men-at-arms developed combat skills through constant practice, hunting, and martial games, with little specialized training for judicial encounters specifically. By the 13th century, however, as judicial combat became more formalized and technical, specialized training emerged. Masters of arms appeared in major cities, offering instruction and techniques specifically designed for the controlled environment of judicial duels rather than the chaos of the battlefield. These masters developed systematic approaches to combat, eventually producing illustrated manuals, Fechtbücher, that codified their teachings. "The judicial combat differs from war," wrote the German fencing master Hans Dobringer in the early 15th century. "For in war one fights in formation with companions at hand, while in the judicial combat one stands alone before God and justice, with no aid save one's skill and courage." Physical conditioning formed the foundation of preparation for judicial combat. Endurance was particularly crucial, as duels could last for hours, with combatants wearing heavy armor and engaging in intensely physical exchanges. Contemporary accounts describe training regimens that included running in armor, practicing strikes against posts or pels until arms trembled with exhaustion, and wrestling in weighted clothing to build strength. To prepare for his combat, Sir Thomas exercises daily thus, recorded a 14th century English chronicle. First, prayers at dawn, then running for an hour in half armor, then practice with sword and shield until midday, then wrestling with his squires, and finally more sword work until vespers. This he has done daily for 3 months. Technical training grew increasingly sophisticated as the medieval period progressed. Early training emphasized basic strikes and blocks, building on techniques useful in warfare. By the 14th and 15th centuries, specialized systems had developed, with Italian, German, and Spanish traditions, each emphasizing different approaches to combat. These systems included not just techniques with various weapons, but concepts of timing, distance, and tactical decision-making. The German fighting tradition, preserved in numerous 15th century Fechtbücher, emphasized principles such as Indes, timing, Fühlen, feeling or sensitivity to the opponent's pressure, and Vorschlag, initiative. These concepts created a sophisticated framework for understanding combat as a dynamic exchange rather than mere physical contest. Similar developments occurred in Italian traditions, where masters such as Fiore de' Liberi developed systematic approaches to judicial combat with various weapons. When your opponent presses strongly against your sword, instructed Fiore in his 1409 manual Flos Duellatorum, do not resist directly, but yield to his pressure while stepping offline, thus creating an opening for your counterstrike. Training typically progressed from individual movements practiced in isolation to controlled exchanges with partners, gradually increasing in speed and intensity. Wooden wasters, practice swords, rebaited, blunted weapons, and padded armor allowed realistic practice while reducing the risk of serious injury. Nevertheless, training accidents occurred with sufficient frequency that some regions developed legal distinctions between deaths in sanctioned practice and other forms of homicide. If a man dies while practicing the arts of war under proper supervision, stated a 13th century legal text from Bologna, this shall not be counted as murder, but as misfortune, provided witnesses confirm the death occurred during honest practice without malice. Psychological preparation proved as important as physical training. Judicial combat subjected participants to extreme stress, combining the physical demands of combat with the knowledge that defeat might mean not just loss, but execution. Masters developed methods to prepare their students mentally as well as physically, including visualization techniques, graduated exposure to stress, and philosophical approaches to managing fear. 3 things defeat a man before his opponent does, taught the Spanish master Jaime Pons in 1474. First, doubt in his cause. Second, fear of death. Third, concern for what onlookers think. The skilled master must teach his pupil to overcome these inner enemies before facing the outer one. Some accounts describe remarkably modern-seeming psychological techniques. Combatants were advised to visualize successful outcomes, to control breathing when under pressure, and to develop focusing rituals to center themselves before and during combat. One 15th century Italian master advised his students to make your fear a servant rather than a master, by acknowledging its presence but directing attention to specific technical tasks rather than potential consequences. Training often included spiritual preparation as well. Many combatants undertook religious observances during their training period, attending Mass daily, making special donations to churches, or even sponsoring prayers and masses specifically for success in their upcoming ordeal. These practices reflected the belief that judicial combat revealed divine judgment, making spiritual preparation as necessary as physical training. Sir Geoffrey attended Mass each morning before training, noted a chronicle from 1352, and each night prayed for 2 hours before the altar of Saint Michael, patron of warriors, that his arm might be strengthened by divine favor when the day of combat arrived. For combatants facing significantly more experienced or skilled opponents, training took on particular urgency. Historical accounts describe intensive crash courses for those suddenly faced with judicial combat, with masters attempting to impart in weeks or months skills that normally required years to develop. Such compressed training typically focused on a limited repertoire of techniques, a few reliable attacks and defenses, rather than a comprehensive system. Having only 6 weeks to prepare the merchant for his combat, recorded a Flemish account from 1385, Master Henry taught him but 3 guards and 5 strikes, drilling these day and night until the merchant could perform them even when woken suddenly from sleep. Social class significantly influenced training opportunities. Knights and nobles typically began martial education in childhood, receiving instruction in weapons, horsemanship, and wrestling from an early age. By contrast, commoners facing judicial combat might have little or no prior combat experience, necessitating intensive preparation under significant time pressure. Some cities maintained combat masters specifically to train burghers who became involved in judicial proceedings, recognizing that access to training represented a form of procedural fairness. As John de Metz continued drilling his young charge in the Aquitanian courtyard, his approach reflected centuries of accumulated knowledge about preparing for judicial combat. The technical exercises, specific strikes and counters practiced until they became instinctive, derived from an established pedagogical tradition. The psychological coaching, teaching Guillaume to manage fear and maintain focus under pressure, drew on generations of experience preparing men for ordeals where failure often meant death. "Again," Jean commanded, raising his practice sword. "Remember, young Savary will not be tired or hesitant on the day. He will come at you believing God strengthens his arm because his cause is just. You must move with such certainty that doubt enters his mind, not yours." As Guillaume settled into his guard position, the wooden sword steady in his hands despite hours of practice, he embodied a tradition where combat served as both physical contest and spiritual ordeal. The training that would determine whether he lived or died 3 weeks hence was not merely technical instruction, but initiation into a complex system where violence became the vehicle for divine judgment and social resolution. The winter sun cast long shadows across the enclosed field at Saint-Martin-des-Champs in Paris, as thousands of spectators pressed against the barriers, their breath forming clouds in the December air. Inside the combat area, 2 men prepared to kill one another, Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, once friends, now deadly enemies. The date was December 29, 1386, and all of Paris had turned out to witness what would become one of the most famous judicial duels in French history. The conflict that brought these men to this deadly encounter had begun months earlier, with an accusation that shook French noble society to its core. When Jean de Carouge returned from a journey to Scotland in early 1386, his wife Marguerite made a shocking claim. During her husband's absence, Jacques Legris, a squire in the service of Count Pierre d'Alençon, and once a friend to Carouge, had come to their castle at Capomesnil and raped her while the household was away. "He forced himself upon me," Marguerite reportedly told her husband, saying that if I spoke of it, none would believe me against his word. This accusation set in motion a complex legal process that would eventually culminate in the trial by combat that captivated Paris. Initially, Carouge brought the charge before Count Pierre, the local lord to whom both men owed feudal allegiance. The count, who favored Legris, dismissed the accusation, suggesting Marguerite had dreamed the encounter or mistaken another man for Legris. Undeterred, Carouge escalated the matter to the Parliament of Paris, the highest royal court. After lengthy deliberations, the Parliament determined that the case could not be resolved through normal legal procedures. With no witnesses beyond the accused and accuser, and with both parties maintaining their positions, the court ordered trial by combat, a judicial duel to determine the truth through divine judgment. The stakes could not have been higher. If Carouge lost, not only would he die in combat, but his wife Marguerite would be burned at the stake as a false accuser. If Legree lost, his death in combat would confirm his guilt, his property would be confiscated, and his name would be forever dishonored. The case attracted enormous attention throughout France. Legree, an educated man with legal training, had risen through service to Count Pierre, accumulating wealth and influence that had stirred jealousy. Carouge, by contrast, was a more traditional knight whose military service abroad had earned him prestige, but whose relationship with Count Pierre had deteriorated through a series of land disputes, some involving properties that eventually went to Legree. These circumstances led many to speculate that Marguerite's accusation might be motivated by her husband's jealousy of Legree's rise or resentment over lost properties. Others pointed to specific details in Marguerite's account, particularly her claim that Legree had mentioned things only he would know, as evidence of her truthfulness. The case divided French society, with some supporting Carouge and others convinced that Legree had been falsely accused. As the appointed day approached, both men prepared intensively. Carouge, an experienced soldier who had fought in Scotland and crusaded in Eastern Europe, practiced daily with sword and shield. Legree, less experienced in warfare but physically powerful, trained under combat masters brought to Paris specifically for this purpose. Both men made wills, attended confession, and put their worldly affairs in order. Standard preparations for men who knew that one of them would not leave the field alive. "Let God strengthen the arm of him who speaks truth," declared the royal herald as the combatants entered the field on that December morning in 1386. Both men came armed as knights, wearing plate armor with great helms, carrying shields, and wielding lances for the mounted phase of combat. They would begin on horseback, charging with lances, then continue on foot with swords if neither secured victory in the initial exchange. As was customary, they swore solemn oaths before the combat, each affirming the justice of his cause and denying any use of sorcery or unfair advantage. "I swear by God and St. George that my cause is just and true," Carouge declared, his voice carrying across the hushed field. "This man did violate my wife against her will, and for this crime I will take his life with God's help." Legree, when his turn came, was equally firm. "I swear by God and my hopes of heaven that I am innocent of this charge. I never touched this man's wife, nor did I enter his castle on the day claimed, and I stand ready to prove my innocence through combat." The first charge with lances proved inconclusive, both men striking solid blows that failed to unseat their opponent. After a second charge with similar results, the marshal of the field ordered them to dismount and continue on foot. What followed was a grueling sword combat that, according to contemporary accounts, lasted for hours. Both men were skilled and determined, and the combat swung back and forth. At one point, Legree managed to wound Carouge in the thigh, drawing first blood and causing many spectators to believe he would emerge victorious. Carouge, however, fought on despite his injury, his determination perhaps strengthened by the knowledge that his wife's life depended on his victory. The decisive moment came when Carouge managed to drive Legree to the ground. In the ensuing struggle, he forced up his opponent's visor and demanded a confession. When Legree maintained his innocence, Carouge drove his dagger through Legree's throat, ending the combat with a decisive, if gruesome, victory. "God has revealed the truth," the herald proclaimed as Carouge knelt in prayer beside his slain opponent, blood staining the frost-covered ground. The aftermath of this famous combat reveals much about the complex relationship between judicial duels and broader systems of justice in medieval society. Carus was declared the victor and, by extension, truthful in his accusation. Legris, deceased, was considered guilty by virtue of his defeat. His property was confiscated, and his body was turned over to the public executioner, who hung it on the gibbet at Montfaucon, the final humiliation for a convicted criminal. Carus received substantial rewards for his victory. King Charles VI granted him a prize of 6,000 livres, an enormous sum, and a position in the royal household. His prestige significantly enhanced by the combat and its outcome, Carus later joined the crusade to Hungary, where he died fighting at the Battle of Nicopolis in 1396. Marguerite, vindicated by her husband's victory, returned to a normal life, though sources differ on whether the trauma of both the original crime and the subsequent ordeal affected her lastingly. Some accounts suggest she bore Carus a son after these events, while others indicate the couple remained childless. What made the Carus-Legris duel particularly significant was not just its high profile, but the questions it raised about judicial combat as a method of determining truth. Even at the time, some observers expressed doubts about whether divine judgment had truly been revealed through combat. Jean Juvenal de Ursins, a contemporary chronicler, noted that many believed that the lady had wrongfully accused Jacques Legris, suggesting that even Carus's victory did not entirely settle public opinion. These doubts gained unexpected support years after the combat, when a criminal condemned to death reportedly confessed to the rape of Marguerite de Carus, claiming he had been able to commit the crime because his resemblance to Legris had led her to misidentify him. Whether this confession actually occurred remains disputed. Some historians consider it apocryphal, but its persistence in historical accounts reflects lingering uncertainty about whether justice was truly served by the combat. The Carus affair thus perfectly encapsulates both the appeal and the limitations of judicial combat as a legal institution. On one hand, it provided resolution to a case that conventional legal procedures could not decide, with no witnesses and contradictory testimony from the principals. On the other hand, it determined truth solely through physical prowess and perhaps luck, raising the troubling possibility that an innocent man died while his actual attacker went free. As the spectators dispersed from Saint-Martin-des-Champs on that winter afternoon in 1386, they had witnessed more than just a deadly contest between two men. They had observed a legal system at its limits, resorting to combat when evidence and testimony proved insufficient. They had seen a society that still believed, at least officially, that God would reveal truth through the clash of arms. And perhaps some had glimpsed the contradictions that would eventually lead to the decline of judicial combat as a legal institution. The uneasy recognition that skill in arms did not necessarily correlate with truthfulness or moral right. The Carus-Legris duel would be remembered not just for its drama but for its timing, occurring at a moment when judicial combat was already becoming less common in French legal practice. Within decades, such spectacles would largely disappear from French jurisprudence, replaced by more sophisticated evidentiary procedures. When judicial duels did occur, they would increasingly be seen as extraordinary events rather than routine legal proceedings. Yet the Carus affair would endure in cultural memory, inspiring literary works, historical studies, and eventually film adaptations. Its enduring fascination lies in its perfect distillation of medieval conceptions of justice, honor, truth, and divine intervention. A moment when all these concepts converged in a deadly contest that determined not just who would live and die, But what version of truth would become historical fact? The great hall of Windsor Castle fell silent as King Edward III rose from his throne, his expression grave. Before him knelt two of his nobles, Sir Thomas Holland and Sir John Grey, each accusing the other of treachery during the recent campaign in Brittany. The date was March 1343, and after hours of contradictory testimony and increasingly bitter accusations, the king had made his decision. "Since this matter cannot be resolved through testimony alone," Edward declared, his voice carrying to the furthest corners of the hall, "and since both parties maintain their positions under oath, we decree that truth shall be determined through combat under our royal eye, according to ancient custom." This scene, repeated with variations across the courts of medieval Europe, illustrates the special relationship between monarchy and judicial combat. When kings sanctioned duels, they did more than simply permit violence. They transformed it into a solemn act of justice, invested with royal authority and spiritual significance. The relationship between monarchs and judicial combat was complex and evolving, reflecting changing conceptions of royal power, justice, and divine order. In the early medieval period, kings often personally presided over judicial combats, particularly those involving accusations of treason or other serious crimes against the crown. The monarch's presence served multiple purposes. It emphasized the gravity of the proceedings, it reinforced royal authority over the administration of justice, and it provided symbolic weight to the idea that the combat revealed divine truth. "The king himself shall witness the combat," stated a 10th century Frankish capitulary, "that all may know the judgment comes not merely from men, but from God through the king's authority." The physical settings for these royal-sanctioned combats reflected their importance. While ordinary judicial duels might take place in local fields or town squares, royal combats occurred in spaces that emphasized sovereign power. Palace courtyards, specially constructed lists adjacent to royal residences, or fields prepared specifically for the occasion and marked with royal insignia. At Windsor, Westminster, and other royal seats, permanent areas were sometimes maintained for judicial combats, underscoring their institutional significance. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as royal governance became more sophisticated, monarchs developed more complex relationships with judicial combat. Many kings sought to restrict its use, recognizing that unregulated violence, even when channeled through formal procedures, could threaten royal authority rather than reinforce it. Louis VIII of France, St. Louis, prohibited judicial combat in royal courts in 1258, preferring inquisitorial procedures that gave greater control to royal judges. "We forbid battlefield combat throughout our domain," Louis declared in his famous ordinance, "and in place of battles we establish proof by witnesses and written evidence." Despite such prohibitions, judicial combat persisted, often with royal sanction for exceptional cases. Even Louis XIII, despite his general prohibition, occasionally permitted judicial duels when other procedures seemed inadequate. This pattern, general restriction with specific exceptions, characterized royal approaches to judicial combat throughout the later medieval period, with monarchs balancing traditional practices against emerging legal alternatives. When kings did sanction judicial combats, they often imposed elaborate regulations that simultaneously acknowledged traditional practices while asserting royal control over them. These regulations specified everything from the dimensions of the combat area to the precise weapons permitted, from the oaths to be sworn to the consequences of victory and defeat. By establishing and enforcing these regulations, monarchs transformed potentially disruptive violence into a carefully managed extension of royal justice. By order of the king, began the regulations for a combat at Windsor in 1380. The field shall measure 40 paces in length and 30 in width, enclosed by a double barrier, the inner to separate combatants from spectators, the outer to separate spectators from those not admitted to witness the proceedings. The consequences of royal-sanctioned combats could be particularly severe. When a judicial duel determined guilt or innocence of treason, a crime against the monarch personally, defeat typically meant not just death but public execution, confiscation of property, and often extinction of titles and privileges. The defeated party was considered not merely to have lost a fight, but to have been divinely revealed as a traitor, meriting the most extreme punishment. Sir Thomas, having been overcome in combat, is judged guilty of treason, proclaimed the Royal Herald following a judicial duel at Westminster in 1394. He shall be drawn to Tyburn, there hanged until half dead, then cut down while living to have his entrails removed and burned before his eyes, after which his head shall be struck off and his body quartered, the parts to be displayed at the gates of the city as warning to all who would betray their king. Royal attitudes toward judicial combat varied significantly across Europe. English monarchs generally maintained judicial combat as an option in their courts longer than their French counterparts, though with increasing restrictions. In the Holy Roman Empire, imperial authority over judicial combats was less direct, with many duels occurring under the sanction of semi-autonomous princes and nobles rather than the emperor directly. The spectacle of royal-sanctioned combat served important political purposes beyond the immediate resolution of disputes. These carefully staged events reinforced hierarchies, demonstrated the monarch's role as supreme judge, and provided opportunities for displaying royal magnificence. Accounts of royal duels frequently describe elaborate pageantry, processions, ceremonies, feasts that transformed legal proceedings into political theater. Before the combat, the king processed to his viewing stand, recounted a chronicle describing a duel at the French court in 1357, preceded by heralds bearing the royal arms, accompanied by the great officers of state, and followed by the queen and her ladies, all arrayed in such splendor that none could doubt the majesty of the crown under whose authority justice would this day be done. For combatants, fighting under royal sanction carried both privileges and pressures. Victory in a royal-sanctioned duel often brought substantial rewards, grants of land, offices, or money that reflected not just success in combat, but vindication by divine judgment under royal auspices. Conversely, even surviving defeat could bring consequences beyond the immediate legal case, including loss of royal favor that might extend to the defeated party's entire family or faction. As Sir Thomas Holland and Sir John Grey prepared for their combat at Windsor in 1343, they experienced both the practical and psychological implications of royal involvement. Their training took place under the supervision of officers appointed by the king. Their equipment was inspected by royal armorers, and their conduct was governed by regulations established by royal authority. Beyond these practical matters, they bore the weight of knowing that they fought not just for their lives and honor, but under the direct gaze of their sovereign. Remember, Sir Thomas's mentor advised him the night before combat, "Tomorrow you fight not merely against Sir John, but before the king himself. Each stroke of your sword must demonstrate not just skill, but loyalty, not just strength, but righteousness." The combat, when it occurred, lasted less than an hour. Sir Thomas, the more experienced warrior, gradually forced Sir John onto the defensive, eventually landing a powerful blow that shattered his opponent's shoulder. When Sir John fell, unable to continue, the royal herald immediately proclaimed Sir Thomas vindicated and Sir John revealed as a traitor through combat. King Edward, rising from his viewing stand, pronounced the formal judgment. Sir John, having been overcome in sanctioned combat, was guilty of the treason alleged. His lands would be forfeit to the crown, his titles extinguished, and he himself would face execution unless the king granted mercy. In this case, perhaps influenced by Sir John's previous service or by political considerations, Edward commuted the death sentence to perpetual imprisonment. A demonstration of royal clemency that emphasized the monarch's power to temper justice with mercy. As judicial combat gradually declined in the later medieval period, royal involvement became increasingly exceptional rather than routine. When monarchs did sanction duels, these events were treated as extraordinary spectacles rather than normal judicial proceedings. The 1386 duel between Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris, fought before King Charles VI of France, represented one of the last major judicial combats sanctioned by the French monarchy, a spectacular exception to the general movement away from trial by combat. By the 15th century, monarchs throughout Western Europe had largely replaced judicial combat with more controlled legal procedures. The increasing sophistication of royal courts, the influence of Roman and canon law, and changing theological attitudes all contributed to this shift. When judicial duels did occur with royal sanction, they were increasingly framed as acts of special grace rather than normal judicial process, exceptions that proved the rule of royal control over legitimate violence. The legacy of royal-sanctioned judicial combat would endure, however, in the elaborate regulations that later governed duels of honor. Many of the procedures and formalities that characterized early modern dueling derived from the traditions established for royal judicial combats, preserving elements of a legal institution that had officially disappeared. Even as kings prohibited dueling among their subjects, the memory of royally sanctioned combat continued to lend legitimacy to the concept of regulated violence as a means of resolving certain types of disputes. As Edward III returned to his chambers following the Holland Grey combat, attended by his counselors and officials, he participated in a tradition that balanced on the cusp of significant change. The royal sanction he had given to this judicial duel represented both the continuity of ancient practice and its gradual transformation into something new, a process that would eventually replace the clash of arms with the deliberations of judges as the primary embodiment of royal justice. The crowd pressed close around the marked circle in the village green of Northleach, their breath visible in the crisp autumn air. At the circle's edge stood two men, Thomas Weaver and John Fletcher, neither of noble birth, neither trained in the martial arts of knighthood, yet about to engage in combat as formalized and consequential as any between armored nobles. The year was 1321, and this Gloucestershire village was witness to a form of judicial combat rarely recorded in chronicles, but far more common than the celebrated duels of knights and nobles. "Let all present witness," called the village bailiff, "that these men, having brought a dispute before the manor court, and witnesses having been heard without resolution, they have by mutual consent been granted trial by battle according to the custom of this manor." While popular imagination and historical accounts often focus on judicial combats between knights or nobles, the practice extended far beyond the elite classes. Throughout the medieval period, commoners, peasants, townspeople, merchants, and artisans engaged in judicial duels to resolve disputes ranging from land boundaries to accusations of theft or assault. These common duels, though less frequently documented than their aristocratic counterparts, reveal important dimensions of medieval justice and its social applications. The regulations governing common duels differed significantly from those for knightly combat. Recognizing that commoners lacked the martial training and equipment of the nobility, local customs typically prescribed simpler weapons and less lethal conditions. In many English manorial courts, combatants fought with wooden clubs or staves rather than swords, wearing no armor beyond perhaps padded garments. Similar adaptations appeared throughout Europe, with regional variations reflecting local traditions and resources. They shall fight with staves of equal length, their heads uncovered, wearing only simple tunics, with no armor or shield, specified the regulations for a combat in a Burgundian village in 1298. Neither shall bring knife or other weapon to the field, on pain of being judged forfeit. The physical settings for common duels typically reflected their more modest scale. Rather than elaborate lists constructed for knightly tournaments, commoners might fight in village greens, churchyards, or fields specially marked for the occasion. The boundaries might be as simple as a circle scratched in the earth or marked with stakes, with spectators forming a human barrier around the designated area. Despite these simpler arrangements, common duels followed prescribed procedures that echoed those of aristocratic combats. Combatants swore oaths affirming their claims, weapons were inspected to ensure equality, and the proceedings were overseen by local officials, bailiffs, reeves, or village elders, who ensured adherence to established customs. The formality of these procedures, even in humble settings, underscores the legal significance of these encounters. John Fletcher swears by God and the saints that Thomas Weaver did willfully move the boundary stone between their fields, recorded the clerk of the Northleach Manor Court, and Thomas Weaver swears the same oath that he did not move said stone but found it thus. Having no other proof, they will determine truth through combat according to custom. The stakes in common duels, while typically not involving execution or enormous property forfeitures, could nevertheless be significant relative to the participants' circumstances. A defeat might result in fines beyond a commoner's ability to pay, leading to debt bondage or loss of tenancy. In more serious cases, particularly those involving alleged crimes, defeat could still result in corporal punishment, banishment, or even execution, depending on local custom and the nature of the accusation. Common duels resolved a wide range of disputes: land boundaries, water rights, accusations of theft, damaged property, unpaid debts, and personal injuries all featured prominently in recorded cases. In urban settings, conflicts between guild members or merchants might be resolved through combat when testimony proved contradictory or inconclusive. Even in ecclesiastical courts, which generally opposed judicial combat, certain property disputes involving lay persons might be referred to combat when other evidence proved insufficient. The dispute between Miller and Smith concerning water rights to the stream shall be determined by combat, stated a decision from a manorial court in Sussex in 1335, neither having writing to prove his claim and witnesses having spoken differently on the matter. The frequency of common duels varied significantly across regions and time periods. In some areas, particularly where Roman legal influences were stronger, judicial combat among commoners declined earlier than among the nobility. In others, particularly more remote regions with limited access to developed court systems, the practice persisted well into the 15th century and beyond, long after aristocratic judicial combat had largely disappeared. Gender considerations in common duels reveal interesting complexities. While aristocratic judicial combat was almost exclusively male, records of common duels occasionally include women as participants. In some regions, customs permitted women to fight in person against male opponents, though typically with handicaps intended to balance physical differences. More commonly, women might appoint male champions, often relatives or hired combatants, to fight on their behalf. The widow Cooper, having no male relation to serve as champion, has hired William Strong to fight in her cause against Richard Baker, noted a Market Towns court record from 1356. The court finds this acceptable, Strong having sworn he receives only fair payment for his service and has no other interest in the dispute. Professional champions, men who made their living fighting in judicial combats for hire, emerged in some regions, particularly in urban settings. These fighters, sometimes former soldiers or men with particular physical prowess, offered their services to those unwilling or unable to fight in person. Their existence was controversial, with some local authorities restricting or prohibiting hired champions as contrary to the principle that combat revealed divine truth. No hired champion shall be permitted in disputes concerning land or criminal matters, declared a municipal ordinance from Frankfurt in 1338, but only in matters of debt, or minor injury, and then only if the hiring party be a woman, a cleric, or a man beyond 50 years or suffering bodily infirmity. The relationship between common duels and broader systems of justice evolved throughout the medieval period. In earlier centuries, judicial combat represented one option among several for resolving disputes, alongside oath-helping, where supporters swore to a person's truthfulness, ordeal by fire or water, and increasingly, inquisitorial procedures. As royal and ecclesiastical courts developed more sophisticated approaches to evidence and testimony, judicial combat gradually became less central to common justice, though it persisted longest in manorial courts and other local jurisdictions. When Thomas Weaver and John Fletcher squared off in the Northleach village green, they participated in a tradition that embodied community justice in a direct and visceral form. Without lawyers, elaborate procedures, or extensive documentation, their dispute would be resolved through physical contest, a method that reflected both the limitations and the pragmatism of local medieval justice. The combat itself lasted less than 20 minutes. Both men, weathered by years of agricultural labor, showed remarkable endurance as they exchanged blows with their wooden staves. Fletcher, the younger and stronger of the two, gradually forced Weaver back toward the circle's edge. When a powerful strike sent Weaver stumbling to his knees, unable to rise immediately, the bailiff declared the combat concluded. "God has shown his judgment," the bailiff announced. John Fletcher's claim is proven true. Thomas Weaver shall restore the boundary stone to its proper place, pay a fine of 12 pence to the Lord's court, and 6 pence to Fletcher for false accusation. For the assembled villagers, this outcome represented not just the resolution of a specific dispute, but the restoration of community harmony through established custom. The combat had demonstrated not merely who was physically stronger, but in their understanding, who spoke truth, an outcome with moral and spiritual significance beyond the immediate practical consequences. As judicial combat gradually declined among commoners in the later medieval period, its functions were absorbed by evolving legal institutions. Royal courts extended their reach into local matters. Written records became more prevalent even in rural settings, and alternative methods of proof gradually replaced physical contest. Yet in many communities, memories of trial by combat persisted in local customs, folk traditions, and community understanding of justice long after the practice itself had disappeared from legal proceedings. The common duels of medieval Europe, though less celebrated than their aristocratic counterparts, reveal important dimensions of medieval justice. Its accessibility across social classes, its adaptation to local circumstances, and its balance between formal procedure and practical resolution. In these humble contests on village greens and town squares, medieval communities enacted a form of justice that, for all its limitations, offered direct and comprehensible resolution to disputes that might otherwise have festered beyond official notice. As Thomas Weaver and John Fletcher departed the village green that autumn day in 1321, one vindicated, one chastened, both still neighbors who would need to coexist in the same small community, they embodied both the strengths and weaknesses of this direct form of justice. Their combat had resolved a specific dispute, but not necessarily revealed objective truth. It had restored immediate peace, but perhaps left lingering resentments. Like the aristocratic duels conducted before kings and nobles, these common contests balanced precariously between divine judgment and human fallibility, between abstract justice and practical necessity. The morning mist still clung to the meadow outside Amiens as servants drove stakes into the damp ground, marking the boundaries of what would soon become a field of mortal combat. Banners bearing the royal arms of France fluttered alongside those of the Duke of Burgundy, under whose authority this judicial duel would take place. The year was 1405, and the combat about to unfold represented the culmination of French traditions that had evolved over centuries, creating a distinctive approach to regulated violence as a form of legal proof. By ancient custom and royal ordinance, declared the chief herald as spectators gathered, this field is prepared for the trial by combat between Jean de Vernay, accuser, and Philippe de Saint-Alban, defender, to determine truth concerning matters that cannot be resolved by testimony alone. French approaches to judicial combat reflected the complex legal landscape of medieval France, a patchwork of royal law, feudal custom, and regional variation, gradually moving toward centralization under royal authority. From the early Frankish period through the 15th century, French traditions of judicial combat evolved significantly while maintaining distinctive characteristics that separated them from practices in neighboring regions. The earliest documented judicial combats in French territories appear in Merovingian and Carolingian legal texts, reflecting Germanic traditions incorporated into Frankish governance. The capitularies of Charlemagne, particularly those issued after 803, included regulations for judicial duels, indicating their established place in Frankish legal practice by the early 9th century. If a man accuses another of perjury, stated a Carolingian capitulary from 819, and the accused denies it, the matter shall be decided by combat if they be of equal status, or by the ordeal of hot iron if they be not. As feudal institutions developed in the 10th and 11th centuries, judicial combat became embedded in the legal practices of various French regions, with significant local variations. Northern French customs, preserved in texts such as the Très Ancien Coutumier de Normandie, detailed elaborate procedures for different types of cases. Southern regions, more influenced by Roman legal traditions, generally placed greater restrictions on judicial combat, limiting its use to specific circumstances where other forms of proof proved inadequate. A distinctive feature of French judicial combat was the gradual development of specialized procedural manuals. By the 13th century, texts such as Le Livre de Justice et de Plet and Philippe de Beaumanoir's Coutumes de Beauvaisis provided detailed guidance on when combat could be employed, how it should be conducted, and what consequences would follow. These texts reflected a systematic approach to judicial combat as an integral component of a developing legal framework. Combat may be ordered in cases of murder, wrote Beaumanoir around 1283, when the accused is indicated by strong presumption, but not by direct witness, provided the deceased was discovered within 1 day of the killing and proper hue and cry was raised. The physical settings for French judicial combats evolved over time. In the earlier medieval period, combats often occurred in relatively informal settings, fields or clearings designated for the purpose. By the 13th century, more formal arrangements had emerged. Major feudal courts maintained designated areas for judicial combats, often adjacent to castles or manor houses, while royal combats typically occurred in specially prepared fields near centers of royal authority. The most famous location for royal judicial combats was the Preux-Clercq in Paris, a field near the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés that served as the site for numerous high-profile duels. When Jean de Carouge and Jacques Legris fought their famous duel in 1386, however, the location shifted to Saint-Martin-des-Champs, perhaps reflecting the exceptional nature of this particular combat. French traditions placed particular emphasis on preliminary legal procedures before combat could be authorized. Accusations had to be formally presented, initial testimony heard, and judicial determinations made regarding the appropriateness of combat as a method of proof. These procedures grew increasingly elaborate over time, reflecting both the integration of judicial combat into a developing legal system and gradual restrictions on its use. No combat shall be ordered until 3 court sessions have examined the matter. Specified royal regulations from 1306, with testimony recorded and examined by the king's judges, and combat approved only when no other means can determine the truth. The actual conduct of French judicial combats followed highly formalized patterns. Combatants typically began on horseback with lances, then proceeded to dismounted combat with swords if neither secured victory in the initial exchanges. For combats between men of lesser status, simplified versions of these procedures applied, with appropriate modifications to weapons and armor. A distinctive aspect of French practice was the concept of the clameur de haro, a formal accusation made in public that could initiate proceedings potentially leading to judicial combat. This dramatic procedure required the accuser to cry out the accusation publicly, often kneeling and raising their right hand toward heaven, creating a ritual that emphasized the seriousness of the charge and its consequences. Robert stood before the church door after Mass, recorded a Norman chronicle from 1211, and cried the haro against Guillaume, saying, "I accuse this man of murdering my brother by stealth in the night, and I stand ready to prove it upon his body in combat if he denies it." The role of religious elements in French judicial combats was particularly pronounced. Combatants typically attended Mass before combat, made confession, and received the Eucharist. Their weapons were blessed, and they swore solemn oaths on relics or sacred texts. The combat itself was preceded by prayers explicitly framing the encounter as a means by which divine judgment would be revealed. "Grant, O Lord," intoned the priest blessing the weapons for a combat in Rheims in 1378, "that through these instruments truth may be revealed and justice done, that the righteous may be vindicated and the false accuser brought low, according to thy perfect judgment." Royal attitude toward judicial combat in France underwent significant evolution. Early Capetian monarchs generally accepted the practice as an established component of feudal justice. Philip II Augustus, r. 1180 to 1223, regulated rather than prohibited judicial combat, issuing ordinances that standardized procedures while maintaining the institution itself. The watershed moment came under Louis X, St. Louis, whose judicial reforms of 1258 prohibited judicial combat in royal domains, though the practice continued in territories under feudal jurisdiction. "We entirely forbid judicial combat," declared Louis's famous ordinance, "and in place of combat we establish proof by witnesses, written evidence, and other legitimate means of determining truth. Despite this royal prohibition, judicial combat persisted in France throughout the 13th and 14th centuries, particularly in territories where royal authority remained limited. Even within royal domains, exceptions were occasionally granted for particularly difficult cases or high-profile disputes. The combat between Carouge and Legris in 1386, occurring more than a century after Louis XIV's prohibition, demonstrates the enduring place of judicial combat in French legal culture, despite official restrictions. A particularly French innovation was the development of the combat à outrance, combat to the extreme, a form of judicial duel explicitly intended to continue until one participant was killed or admitted defeat. This contrasted with less lethal forms of regulated combat used for lesser offenses or civil disputes. The combat outrance, typically reserved for accusations of capital crimes or treason, represented the most solemn and consequential form of judicial combat in French tradition. The preparations for the judicial duel at Amiens in 1405 reflected these accumulated traditions. Both combatants had progressed through elaborate legal preliminaries, with initial accusations, counterclaims, and judicial determinations all documented in formal proceedings. Religious ceremonies had been conducted the previous day, with both men making confession, receiving communion, and participating in the blessing of their weapons. As John de Vernay and Philippe de Saint-Aubin entered the field that morning, each accompanied by his seconds and advisors, they enacted roles precisely defined by centuries of evolving custom. Their equipment: horses with specialized saddles designed for judicial combat, lances of regulation length, swords and daggers inspected by officials, conformed to detailed specifications established through both written ordinances and unwritten tradition. The combat itself unfolded according to established protocols. After the initial charge with lances proved inconclusive, the men dismounted for sword combat. For over an hour they fought, skilled, determined, and acutely aware of the stakes. When Jean de Vernay finally drove his opponent to the ground and forced him to yield, the conclusion was not merely a physical victory, but the culmination of a legal process, divine judgment revealed through combat, concluding a dispute that human testimony alone could not resolve. "God has shown his judgment," proclaimed the herald as Jean knelt in prayer beside his defeated opponent. "Let all present witness that the accusation is proven true, and let justice now follow according to law and custom." French traditions of judicial combat would continue to evolve into the 15th century, gradually giving way to changing legal practices and shifting attitudes toward violence as a means of proof. The formal judicial duel would increasingly be replaced by the duel of honor, a transformation that reflected broader social changes while preserving elements of the older tradition in new forms. Yet the elaborate French approach to judicial combat, with its detailed procedures, religious elements, and integration into formal legal structures, would leave a lasting imprint on European conceptions of regulated violence as a means of resolving otherwise intractable disputes. Autumn rain fell steadily on the muddy field outside Lincoln, as Sir Robert Thorpe and Sir William Dacre prepared to settle their dispute through combat. The year was 1350, and this judicial duel, concerning contested rights to a valuable manor, represented the culmination of legal proceedings that had wound through royal courts for over a year. Now, with documentary evidence contradictory and witness testimony inconclusive, the matter would be resolved through England's distinctive approach to trial by battle. "Oyez, oyez," called the King's herald over the pattering rain. "This field is now a court of our Lord King Edward, third of that name, wherein truth shall be determined by combat according to the ancient custom of this realm. English traditions of judicial combat developed along a distinctive trajectory, influenced by the Norman conquest, the early centralization of royal authority, and the unique development of English common law. From Anglo-Saxon origins through the 15th century, English approaches to trial by battle reflected both continuity with continental practices and significant local adaptations. The Anglo-Saxon period saw limited use of judicial combat, with oath-helping and ordeals more commonly employed as methods of proof. The Norman conquest of 1066 brought continental practices more firmly into English legal tradition, with the Normans introducing formalized judicial combat as a regular feature of legal proceedings, particularly in land disputes and certain criminal matters. William the Conqueror's legal reforms preserved many Anglo-Saxon institutions while introducing Norman elements, creating a hybrid system where judicial combat coexisted with older forms of proof. The Leges Henrici Primi, compiled during the reign of Henry I, 1100 to 1135, detailed circumstances under which trial by battle could be employed, indicating its established place in early Anglo-Norman jurisprudence. If a man born in England accuses a Norman of perjury or murder, stated this legal compilation, the Norman may defend himself by combat if he chooses, or by ordeal of iron if combat is declined. A distinctive feature of English judicial combat emerged through its incorporation into formal legal writs. The writ of right, a legal action to determine ownership of real property, included provisions for trial by battle when other evidence proved insufficient. This integration of combat into standardized legal procedures reflected the systematic character of developing English common law. By the 13th century, precise legal terminology had developed around judicial combat in England. The process was known as wager of battle, and participants were designated as champions rather than simply combatants, even when principals fought in person rather than through hired representatives. This terminology reflected the increasingly formalized nature of English judicial combat as it became embedded in common law procedures. The tenant, having chosen wager of battle to defend his right, recorded a legal case from 1220, shall appear by his champion on the appointed day, armed according to custom, to make good his claim against the champion of the demandant. The physical settings for English judicial combats typically reflected royal authority. Major combats often occurred at Westminster, where a specialized area adjacent to Westminster Hall became the standard location for trials by battle under royal supervision. For combats in county courts or other local jurisdictions, designated fields were prepared according to specifications established by custom and increasingly by written regulations. English judicial combats followed distinctive procedural patterns. Combatants, or their champions, typically fought with baculi cornuti, horn staves, specialized weapons somewhat resembling a shepherd's crook, rather than swords or lances. They wore minimal specialized garments rather than armor, typically leather jerkins and shields bearing painted representations of their claims. Combat continued from sunrise until the stars appeared or until one party yielded by crying, craven, a term that became synonymous with cowardice in English language. They shall fight with the horned staves from the rising of the sun, specified regulations from the 14th century, until the stars appear in the evening, or until one cries craven, or is driven beyond the bounds of the field, or is vanquished by the judgment of God. The legal consequences of English judicial combat were precisely defined. In land disputes, the defeated party lost not just the specific case but all claims to the disputed property permanently. In criminal matters, defeated accusers faced imprisonment and heavy fines for false accusation, while defeated defendants faced execution or, in less serious cases, mutilation appropriate to their crime. A distinctive aspect of English tradition was the early development of professional champions, individuals who made their living representing litigants in judicial combat. By the 13th century, records indicate established practices around hiring these specialized combatants, with detailed contracts specifying payment terms, preparation arrangements, and consequences should the champion fail to appear or perform adequately. The agreement between Ralph of Leicester and Thomas Champion stated a contract from 1275, wherein Thomas shall represent Ralph in the wager of battle concerning lands at Melton, receiving 10 marks before the combat and 10 more if victorious, providing his own equipment and swearing to fight faithfully unto victory or defeat. English attitudes toward these professional champions were ambivalent. Legal theorists acknowledged that hired champions potentially undermined the theological premise of judicial combat, that God revealed truth through physical contest. Yet practical considerations led to their acceptance within the system. By the 14th century, legal procedures had adapted to this reality, with oaths modified to focus on the justice of the cause rather than personal knowledge of disputed facts. The influence of ecclesiastical attitudes on English judicial combat was significant but complex. The Church generally opposed trial by battle, preferring inquisitorial procedures and documentary evidence. Yet ecclesiastical authorities in England, as elsewhere, maintained ambivalent relationships with the practice. Some church courts prohibited judicial combat entirely, while others permitted it under specific circumstances, particularly in disputes over land held from ecclesiastical lords. No combat shall be permitted in matters touching spiritual goods, declared a decree of the Archbishop of Canterbury in A.D. 1313. Yet in disputes concerning lay fees held of the Church, common law shall apply if the matter cannot otherwise be determined. Royal attitude toward judicial combat in England evolved considerably over time. Early Norman and Angevin kings actively supported the practice, viewing it as a means of extending royal justice while respecting feudal custom. Henry II's legal reforms in the 12th century began a gradual process of offering alternatives to combat through new forms of legal action, creating options rather than prohibitions. A crucial development came in 1219, when a royal directive established that defendants could decline combat in favor of having their case decided by a jury, a process known as putting oneself on the country. This alternative, while not eliminating judicial combat, significantly reduced its frequency by providing a less risky option for those who doubted their chances in physical contest. The defendant may choose either to defend by his body in combat, stated this directive, or to put himself upon the country, that the truth may be determined by 12 good men and true of the neighborhood. Despite these alternatives, judicial combat persisted in English legal practice longer than in many continental jurisdictions. Cases of wager of battle continued to appear in legal records throughout the 14th and 15th centuries, though with decreasing frequency. The practice remained technically available in English law long after it had ceased to be commonly employed, creating a curious legal fossil preserved within common law tradition. As Sir Robert Thorpe and Sir William Dacre faced each other on that rainy autumn day outside Lincoln in 1350, they participated in a tradition that balanced between obsolescence and persistence. Their combat, fought with the traditional horned staves, wearing the prescribed simple garments rather than armor, followed procedures virtually unchanged since the 12th century, yet occurred in a legal context where such encounters had become increasingly exceptional rather than routine. The combat lasted for hours, both men displaying remarkable endurance as they circled and struck in the increasingly muddy field. When Sir William finally slipped and fell, momentarily exposed to a decisive blow, Sir Robert held back, an uncharacteristic mercy in judicial combat. Taking advantage of this hesitation, Sir William regained his footing and, in a sudden reversal, landed a powerful strike that drove Sir Robert to his knees. "I yield," Sir Robert gasped, the words barely audible over the rain. "The manor is yours by right." With these words, legally equivalent to crying craven, though less humiliating in form, the combat concluded, and with it the legal dispute that had occupied royal courts for over a year. Sir William's victory, attributed to divine favor by contemporary observers, established his claim to the disputed manor more definitively than any documentary evidence or witness testimony could have done. This English approach to judicial combat, with its distinctive procedures, specialized terminology, and gradual integration of alternatives, reflected broader patterns in English legal development. The system balanced traditional practices with pragmatic adaptations, preserved ancient forms while developing practical alternatives, and maintained theoretical frameworks that increasingly diverged from everyday reality. The legacy of English judicial combat would extend far beyond its practical disappearance. The terminology and concepts associated with wager of battle influenced English language and culture, with terms like champion and craven acquiring meanings separate from their original legal context. More significantly, the procedural elements of judicial combat, formal challenges, regulated combat, and definitive outcomes, would influence the development of the Code Duello that governed affairs of honor in later centuries. The persistence of judicial combat in English legal theory long outlasted its practical application. Remarkably, wager of battle remained theoretically available in English law until 1819, when Parliament finally abolished it, following a case where a defendant unexpectedly demanded trial by battle, exposing the anachronistic survival of this medieval institution in modern legal structures. In this remarkably long afterlife, preserved in legal theory centuries after its practical disappearance, English judicial combat demonstrated the conservative nature of common law, which could maintain obsolete forms within its structure long after their original purposes had been forgotten. The traditions that shaped the combat between Sir Robert and Sir William in 1350 thus cast shadows extending nearly 5 centuries into the future, connecting medieval conceptions of justice to the dawn of the modern legal era. The early morning sun glinted off the canals of Venice as 2 gondolas glided toward a small island in the northern lagoon. Each boat carried a nobleman and his seconds, bound for a rendezvous where blood would answer the demands of honor. The year was 1425, and the duel about to take place between Antonio Contarini and Marco Bembo represented the distinctive Italian approach to formalized combat, one that had evolved from judicial roots into a sophisticated system focused primarily on matters of personal honor. "Remember," advised the older man accompanying Contarini, "in Venice, the blade speaks when words cannot, but it must speak according to the rules. A wrongful victory brings more dishonor than honorable defeat." Italian traditions of formalized combat evolved along a unique trajectory, shaped by the region's political fragmentation, the early influence of Roman legal concepts, and the distinctive urban culture of its city-states. From judicial origins similar to those in other European regions, Italian dueling developed into a system increasingly focused on personal honor rather than legal proof, establishing patterns that would later influence dueling traditions throughout Europe. The earliest documented judicial combats in Italian territories appear in Lombard legal codes, reflecting Germanic traditions similar to those found in other post-Roman kingdoms. The Edictum Rothari of 643 included provisions for judicial combat in specific circumstances, indicating the integration of this Germanic practice into the governance of Italian territories. If a man accuses another of plotting against the king's life, stated this early Lombard code, and cannot prove it through witnesses, the accused may clear himself through combat if he so chooses. As Italian urban centers developed their distinctive political and legal structures in the 11th and 12th centuries, approaches to judicial combat evolved accordingly. Cities such as Milan, Florence, Bologna, and Venice established their own regulations governing when and how combat could be employed to resolve disputes. These regulations typically reflected the broader legal culture of each city, with some embracing combat as a legitimate method of proof, while others placed significant restrictions on its use. A crucial development in Italian traditions was the early emergence of specialized literature on dueling. By the 13th century, Italian jurists and scholars were producing detailed treatises on the subject, creating a theoretical framework that distinguished Italian approaches from the more customary practices found elsewhere. Works such as Paris de Puteo's Duello, 1472, established comprehensive systems governing when duels could occur, how they should be conducted, and what outcomes should follow. The duel is neither to be sought eagerly nor avoided shamefully, wrote Puteo, but accepted when honor permits no other course, and conducted according to rules that separate it from mere brawling. The physical settings for Italian duels reflected their increasingly ceremonial nature. While early judicial combats might occur in relatively simple enclosed fields, by the 14th and 15th centuries, more elaborate arrangements had emerged. Specialized dueling grounds, often called campi chiusi, closed fields, featured precisely measured dimensions, multiple barriers separating combatants from spectators, and elevated viewing areas for officials and distinguished observers. Italian innovations in weapons and techniques significantly influenced dueling practices. The region's sophisticated metallurgical tradition produced distinctive sword forms optimized for dueling rather than warfare. The emergence of specialized fencing schools, particularly in northern Italian cities, created systematic approaches to combat focusing on skill rather than mere strength or endurance. The sword for the duel should be neither too heavy nor too light, advised the Bolognese master Antonio Manciolino in 1531, drawing on traditions already well established in the previous century. It must allow both cutting and thrusting, with a grip suited to the hand of its wielder, and a guard that protects without impeding movement. A distinctive aspect of Italian dueling was its increasing focus on personal honor rather than divine judgment. While judicial combats throughout Europe had always contained elements of honor defense alongside their function as methods of legal proof, Italian traditions gradually elevated honor to the primary consideration. By the 15th century, many Italian duels occurred not to determine legal matters, but to restore honor damaged by insults, allegations, or breaches of social norms. This transition from judicial function to honor defense accompanied the development of increasingly elaborate honor codes. Italian dueling literature detailed specific offenses that might necessitate a challenge, precise procedures for issuing and responding to challenges, and graduated scales of satisfaction appropriate to different types of offenses. These formalized approaches to honor created a system where dueling, rather than representing a breakdown of social order, became a regulated mechanism for maintaining that order. The lie given directly requires combat, stated a 15th century Venetian treatise on dueling, while the lie by implication may be satisfied by public clarification. The blow with open hand demands blood, while verbal insult may be answered by apology if promptly offered. The legal status of dueling in Italian territories varied significantly across regions and time periods. Some city-states prohibited dueling entirely, with Venice imposing particularly severe penalties for unsanctioned combats within city limits. Others created regulated frameworks where dueling, while technically illegal, might be tolerated under specific circumstances or with appropriate permissions. This complex legal landscape led to the development of specialized dueling grounds just beyond city jurisdictions, allowing combatants to fulfill honor obligations while minimizing legal consequences. Italian attitudes toward seconds and witnesses reflected the increasingly formalized nature of dueling. Rather than merely supporting their principles, seconds became active participants in a complex process, negotiating terms, inspecting weapons, ensuring adherence to agreed procedures, and sometimes determining when honor had been satisfied without need for further bloodshed. This expanded role transformed seconds from simple supporters into something closer to officials, responsible for ensuring that combat occurred within established parameters. The second must serve as both friend and judge, advised a Florentine manual from 1440. He supports his principal in just cause, but restrains him from excess, seeking always to balance the demands of honor with those of reasonable conduct. Religious attitudes toward dueling in Italy were particularly complex. While the Church officially condemned dueling through papal bulls and conciliar decrees, practical accommodation often prevailed, especially among the nobility. Some Italian religious authorities developed conditional approaches, distinguishing between unauthorized private duels, categorically condemned, and regulated public combats with official sanction, sometimes tolerated under specific circumstances. A distinctive feature of Italian dueling was the concept of the cartello, a formal written challenge that not only initiated a duel but established the grievance, proposed conditions, and articulated the honor principles at stake. These documents, often remarkably elaborate, represented the intellectual foundations of Italian dueling culture, transforming potential violence into a formalized discourse on honor and its defense. I, Antonio Contarini, having suffered dishonor through your false words spoken at the council on the 15th day of March, began the cartello delivered to Marco Bembo, do challenge you to meet me with sword and dagger at a place to be agreed upon by our seconds, that I may demonstrate through arms the falseness of your claims and the justness of my cause. As Contarini and Bembo prepared to face each other on that small Venetian island in 1425, they participated in a tradition that had evolved far beyond its judicial origins. Their duel, fought with matched swords and daggers, according to terms negotiated by their seconds, would not determine a legal matter, but restore a balance of honor disrupted by accusations made during a council meeting weeks earlier. The combat began with formal salutes, each man acknowledging his opponent according to established protocol. What followed was not the brutal, strength-focused exchange of earlier judicial combats, but a technical contest reflecting the sophisticated fencing traditions that had developed in Italian cities. For nearly 20 minutes they fought, advancing, retreating, feinting, and striking in patterns that demonstrated years of training under fencing masters. The conclusion came suddenly when Contarini executed a precisely timed thrust that penetrated Bembo's defense, inflicting a significant but not life-threatening wound to the shoulder. With blood visible on Bembo's doublet, the seconds intervened, declaring that honor had been satisfied. After brief consultation, Bembo acknowledged the validity of the outcome, offering his hand to Contarini in a gesture that formally concluded their dispute. "Let all present witness that matters between these gentlemen are now settled," declared Bembo's second. "What passed between them is forgotten, and neither shall speak ill of the other henceforth." This relatively bloodless conclusion, with honor satisfied through demonstration of skill rather than death or serious injury, typified the pragmatic nature of mature Italian dueling culture. The system had evolved to balance the demands of honor with practical concern for preserving the lives of valued members of society, creating mechanisms that allowed disputes to be resolved without necessarily resulting in fatalities. Italian approaches to dueling would exert enormous influence throughout Europe in subsequent centuries. As the judicial duel declined and the duel of honor rose to prominence, Italian models, with their elaborate codes, technical sophistication, and focus on regulated rather than lethal violence, provided templates adopted and adapted across European societies. The treatises of Italian masters became foundational texts for dueling cultures from Spain to Poland, establishing principles that would govern affairs of honor well into the modern era. The legacy of Italian dueling traditions extended beyond specific practices to broader cultural attitudes toward honor, violence, and social regulation. By transforming potentially chaotic violence into highly regulated performance, Italian dueling culture established patterns for managing conflict that balanced individual honor defense with social stability, a balance that would influence European approaches to personal conflict for centuries to come. As Contarini and Bembo returned to their respective gondolas that morning in 1425, their dispute resolved according to established protocols, they enacted not merely a personal drama, but a social process, one that had evolved from judicial roots into a sophisticated system for maintaining honor in societies where reputation and standing remained as valuable as material wealth, and sometimes more so. The crowd roared as the two knights crashed together at the center of the list, lances shattering against shields in a spectacular display of controlled violence. Neither man fell from his saddle, a testament to their skill and the increasingly theatrical nature of such encounters. The year was 1468, and this combat between Anthony Woodville, Lord Scales, and Antoine Bastard of Burgundy represented not a judicial duel, but a celebrated pas d'armes, a formalized combat that preserved the forms of earlier judicial encounters, while transforming their purpose from legal determination to aristocratic spectacle. "A most marvelous and fair course," declared the herald, as both knights wheeled their horses for another pass. "Each gentleman shows most knightly prowess, bringing honor to himself and pleasure to all who witness their noble sport." The evolution of judicial combat into sportive forms represents one of the most significant transformations in the history of formalized violence in medieval Europe. What began as a method of legal proof gradually developed parallel traditions focused on display, skill, and aristocratic identity, rather than legal outcomes. This evolution reflected broader social changes while preserving elements of earlier combat traditions in new contexts. The earliest indications of this transformation appear in 12th century sources, describing military exercises that borrowed elements from judicial combat but served training purposes rather than legal functions. The tournament, initially a relatively unregulated melee fought between teams of knights over extended areas, gradually adopted more formalized characteristics, including defined spaces, specific rules, and ceremonial elements derived from judicial traditions. "They shall fight not in earnest but in play," stated regulations for a tournament in Champagne in 1175, yet with such skill and courage that those watching may judge their worthiness for true combat should need arise. By the 13th century, clear distinctions had emerged between judicial duels, fought to determine legal matters with potentially lethal consequences, and chivalric encounters fought for sport, training, or display. The latter increasingly featured blunted weapons, arms à plaisance, rather than sharp ones, arms à outrance. Specialized protective equipment designed to minimize serious injury, and elaborate scoring systems that rewarded technical skill, rather than simply determining a winner through incapacitation. The joust, a one-on-one encounter between mounted knights with lances, emerged as a specialized form that borrowed heavily from the initial mounted phase of judicial combats. While early judicial duels might begin with lance charges before proceeding to dismounted combat, the joust isolated and elaborated this element, developing increasingly specialized equipment and techniques focused entirely on this form of encounter. For the jousts at pleasure, instructed in English Ordinance from 1466, the lances shall bear coronels, blunted heads rather than points. The shield shall be reinforced at the impact point, and barriers shall separate the riders to prevent collision of horses. The pas d'armes represented a particularly elaborate development in this evolution. These events, especially popular in 15th century Burgundy and France, featured a knight or group of knights who held the field against all comers for a specified period, often days or weeks. Participants fought according to carefully negotiated conditions with elaborate theatrical elements, including costumes, pageantry, and allegorical frameworks that transformed combat into performance. The famous Pas du Perron fait, Pass of the Enchanted Platform, held in Bruges in 1463, exemplified this tradition. Philip the Good, Duke of Burgundy, sponsored this spectacular event, where knights portraying characters from Arthurian romance faced challengers in a series of regulated combats. The elaborate staging, including an artificial tree bearing heraldic shields that challengers would touch to indicate their preferred form of combat, demonstrated how far these encounters had evolved from their judicial origins. First shall be touched the white shield for 7 courses with sharp lances, specified the regulations for this event. Then the violet shield for 11 strokes with rebated swords. Then the black shield for combat on foot with axes until 25 blows have been struck or one combatant is driven from his stance. The transition from justice to sport did not occur uniformly across Europe. In some regions, particularly on the frontiers and in areas with less developed court systems, judicial combat retained its legal function longer. Elsewhere, especially in the courts of Western Europe, the sportive forms developed rapidly, creating parallel traditions that coexisted with increasingly rare judicial encounters. Equipment evolution clearly marked this transition. Judicial combats typically featured weapons designed for maximum effectiveness, sharp, durable, and lethal. Sportive encounters increasingly employed specialized equipment designed to create spectacular effects while minimizing serious injury. Lances designed to shatter impressively on impact, swords with blunted edges and reinforced tips, and helmets modified to remain securely in place even under significant impact. The coronel for sporting jousts shall have 3 blunt points, instructed a 15th century armorer's manual, that it may catch firmly upon the opponent's shield or armor, yet not penetrate, producing good impact that tests skill without undue danger to life or limb. Armor similarly evolved to reflect changing purposes. Judicial combat armor prioritized protection of vital areas while maintaining mobility necessary for effective fighting. Tournament armor, particularly by the 15th century, developed specialized features unlikely in battlefield or judicial contexts. Reinforced left sides, the typical impact point for jousting, additional protective plates over vulnerable areas, and sometimes asymmetrical designs optimized for specific sportive forms rather than general combat effectiveness. The social function of these sportive combats differed significantly from their judicial predecessors, where judicial combat served primarily to resolve otherwise intractable legal disputes. Tournaments and similar encounters increasingly functioned as expressions of aristocratic identity, venues for social networking, opportunities for political display, and mechanisms for training young nobles in martial skills and chivalric values. At the tournament may be observed who is valiant and who is not, wrote the chronicler Jean Froissart in the late 14th century, who may advance in his lord's favor through prowess, and which ladies are most beautiful and worthy of service. Thus does the tournament serve knight, lady, and lord alike. The elaborate regulations governing these sportive encounters reflected their complex social functions. Where judicial combat regulations focused primarily on ensuring procedural fairness in a legal context, tournament ordinances addressed a broader range of concerns: safety provisions, scoring systems, proper conduct toward opponents and spectators, appropriate display of heraldic devices, and often detailed procedures for resolving disputes that might arise during the events. No knight shall strike another after the marshal's trumpet sounds, declared regulations for a tournament in Brussels in 1452. Nor shall any strike his opponent's horse, nor thrust at the face when visors are raised, nor continue against an opponent who has lost a weapon, for such actions bring dishonor rather than glory. Women's roles in these sportive combats differed markedly from judicial contexts. In judicial duels, women typically participated only as parties to disputes, usually represented by male champions rather than fighting personally, though exceptions existed. In tournaments and similar events, women played central roles as spectators, judges, prize givers, and symbolic motivations for combat. The ladies' gallery became a standard feature of tournament settings, emphasizing the connection between martial display and courtly love traditions. The Queen of Beauty shall award prizes to those judged most valiant, specified ordinances for a tournament in London in 1442, considering not only success in combat but grace of bearing, courtesy toward opponents, and overall worthiness as a knight. The psychological experience of sportive combat differed fundamentally from judicial encounters. Participants in judicial duels fought with knowledge that defeat might mean death, dishonor, or severe legal consequences. Tournament combatants, while certainly risking injury and sometimes death through accident, generally faced much lower stakes. This difference transformed the psychological dynamic from one of survival and vindication to one focused on display, technique, and social approval. As Lord Scales and the Bastard of Burgundy continued their celebrated encounter in 1468, they exemplified this transformation. Their combat, fought before King Edward IV of England and an audience of thousands, borrowed forms from judicial tradition, but served entirely different purposes. Neither man sought to kill the other or to prove legal claims. Both sought to demonstrate skill, courage, and adherence to chivalric ideals through technically accomplished performance. The multi-day event included various forms of combat: jousting with lances, dismounted exchanges with swords, and specialized contests with poleaxes. After each day's encounters, both participants joined the royal feast, their combat transforming seamlessly into shared celebration, a social integration impossible in the winner-takes-all context of judicial duels. Both lords fought most valiantly, recorded a chronicle of the event, yet afterward embraced as brothers in chivalry, each having enhanced his honor through worthy performance rather than diminished his opponents through victory. The legacy of this evolution extended far beyond the medieval period, as judicial combat gradually disappeared from European legal systems. The sportive traditions that had developed alongside it continued to evolve. Modern competitive martial activities, from fencing to equestrian sports to combat sports, trace their lineages through these medieval transformations, preserving elements of ancient combat traditions while adapting them to changing social contexts. The tournament tradition itself would continue into the early modern period, gradually becoming more theatrical and less martial, eventually transforming into purely ceremonial displays before disappearing entirely. Yet its influence persisted in cultural conceptions of regulated competition, fair play, and the relationship between individual prowess and social recognition. Concepts that would shape European and eventually global approaches to competitive activities of all kinds. As Lord Scales and the Bastard of Burgundy concluded their final exchange, saluting each other and their royal audience before departing the field together, they enacted a transition centuries in the making, from combat as divine judgment to combat as social performance, from violence as legal procedure to violence as cultural expression. In this transformation, medieval society had not abandoned the regulated violence of earlier centuries, but had repurposed it, creating new meanings and functions for ancient forms. The spring sun illuminated the elaborate pavilions surrounding the tournament field at Bruges, their colorful banners snapping in the breeze as thousands of spectators from across Europe filled the viewing stands. Musicians played from specially constructed platforms, while heralds in brilliant tabards organized the proceedings with practiced efficiency. At the field's center stood the Tree of Challenges, an artificial tree bearing shields in different colors, each representing a different form of combat available to challengers. The year was 1468, and the Tournament of the Golden Tree, sponsored by Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy, represented the culmination of combat as a theatrical spectacle. Let all princes, lords, knights, and squires who wish to gain honor through deeds of arms, proclaimed the chief herald, come forward to touch the shields upon this tree, selecting their preferred form of combat, that they may test themselves against the knights who defend this noble pass. The transformation of medieval combat into elaborate performance represented a significant cultural development, one that reflected changing attitudes toward violence, evolving concepts of nobility, and the increasing importance of display in late medieval court culture. From relatively straightforward judicial ordeals, combat evolved into complex theatrical productions where the spectacle itself often overshadowed the physical contest at its core. The earliest stages of this transformation appeared in the 12th century, when judicial combats began incorporating increasingly elaborate preliminary ceremonies. These initially served primarily legal and religious functions, ensuring procedural fairness and invoking divine judgment. Gradually, however, these ceremonies developed theatrical elements intended to impress spectators and enhance the prestige of those organizing the events. Before the combat, the Earl processed to the field, recorded a chronicle from 1195, preceded by trumpeters and heralds bearing his arms, accompanied by 20 knights in matching livery, and followed by priests bearing relics and holy banners, creating such splendid spectacle that many came more to witness this procession than the combat itself. By the 13th century, non-judicial combats such as tournaments had begun developing their own theatrical traditions. Early tournaments, relatively unregulated affairs, often covering large areas of countryside, gradually transformed into more controlled events with defined performance spaces, specialized roles for participants beyond the combatants themselves, and narrative frameworks that gave meaning to the physical contests. A crucial development came with the emergence of the romantic tournament in the mid-13th century. These events explicitly incorporated elements from Arthurian literature and other romantic traditions, with participants assuming the identities of legendary figures or creating original chivalric personas. This literary framing transformed combat from mere physical contest into narrative performance, with participants enacting roles within collectively created stories. Duke Philip came to the field disguised as a mysterious Black Knight, described a chronicler of a tournament in 1328, refusing to reveal his identity until he had broken lances with 7 opponents, thus enacting the tale of the Black Knight from the Romance of Gawain, to the great delight of the spectators who recognized the story being performed. The physical settings for these theatrical combats grew increasingly elaborate. Early judicial fields and tournament grounds, often simply marked areas with basic barriers, evolved into complex performance spaces, with multiple zones for different activities, specialized structures for various categories of spectators, and elaborate decorative elements that transformed everyday locations into fantastical settings. Particularly significant was the development of the lists, the area where combat occurred, from simple functional space to theatrical environment. By the 15th century, lists for major events featured not just barriers to separate combatants, but decorative elements transforming them into allegorical landscapes. Artificial mountains, enchanted fountains, mysterious pavilions, and symbolic trees all featured in the increasingly elaborate staging of combat performances. For the Tournament of the Golden Tree, recorded a Burgundian chronicle of the 1468 event, the field was transformed into a garden of chivalry, with the great golden tree at its center, bearing the shields of challenge, surrounded by pavilions representing the dwellings of famous knights from romance, and bounded by a stream representing the river that encircles the world, all constructed with such art that many wondered whether they beheld reality or dream. The participants in these theatrical combats played increasingly specialized roles. Beyond the combatants themselves, elaborate events might include challengers and defenders with specific narrative identities, heralds who provided running commentary for spectators, musicians who accompanied different phases of the proceedings, wild men, and other fantastical figures who enacted scripted interruptions, and allegorical characters representing virtues, vices, or supernatural beings. Women's roles in these theatrical combats expanded significantly beyond their limited participation in judicial contexts. Ladies might serve as judges awarding prizes, as allegorical figures representing virtues or geographical regions, as damsels in distress whose symbolic rescue motivated particular combat episodes, or as prizes themselves, with the winner of certain contests earning the right to crown a queen of beauty and love, who presided over subsequent festivities. 12 ladies dressed as nymphs led the 12 defending knights to the field, described an account of a 1463 tournament, each nymph bearing a golden chain with which she had symbolically captured her knight, who fought to prove himself worthy of such beautiful captivity. Costume became increasingly important as combat evolved into performance. Early judicial combatants typically wore practical armor with limited decorative elements. By contrast, participants in 15th century theatrical combats might wear elaborate costumes over or instead of functional armor. Exotic disguises, allegorical outfits representing abstract concepts, or garments depicting scenes from literature or history. Lord Howard entered the lists dressed as a hermit, recorded an account of a 1477 event, wearing a gray robe over his armor and bearing a staff, accompanied by 2 pages dressed as wild beasts who led him as though he were a holy man who had tamed the wilderness, only to cast off this disguise when the trumpet sounded for combat, revealing brilliant armor beneath. The narrative frameworks for these events grew increasingly complex. Where early tournaments might feature simple team competitions or individual challenges, later events often incorporated elaborate storylines extending over multiple days or even weeks. These narratives might adapt literary sources, commemorate historical events, celebrate political alliances, or create entirely original allegorical frameworks connecting the physical contests to broader cultural themes. The famous Pas de l'Arbre d'Or, Pass of the Golden Tree, held at Bruges in 1468, exemplified this development. This elaborate event, celebrating the marriage of Charles the Bold to Margaret of York, centered on an allegorical narrative about a mysterious Knight of the Golden Tree and his companions defending a magical pass against all challengers. The physical combats, jousts, sword fights, and specialized contests were embedded within this narrative, giving them meaning beyond mere competition. The Knight of the Golden Tree has sworn an oath, proclaimed the official challenge distributed throughout Europe months before the event, that he will defend the pass against all worthy challengers for the space of 1 week, in honor of the Most High Princess, whose arrival brings joy to all Burgundy, and to uphold the ancient virtues of chivalry in these modern times. The transformation of combat into theater served important social and political functions. For rulers and high nobles, these spectacular events demonstrated wealth and power, reinforced political alliances, celebrated dynastic achievements, and presented idealized visions of social order. For participants of lesser rank, they offered opportunities to gain visibility, forge connections with powerful patrons, and associate themselves with prestigious cultural traditions. Through this magnificent feat of arms, wrote a contemporary observer of the 1468 Burgundian tournament, Duke Charles demonstrated not merely his wealth, which all knew to be great, nor merely his martial prowess, which none doubted, but his worthiness to stand among the greatest princes of Christendom at a time when his ambitions required such recognition. The economic dimensions of these theatrical combats were substantial. Major events required enormous investments. Constructing temporary structures, creating elaborate costumes and props, feeding and housing participants and spectators, and providing prizes worthy of the occasion. Records from 15th century courts indicate that tournament expenses often exceeded those for major diplomatic initiatives or military campaigns, reflecting their importance in court culture. Beyond their immediate spectacular impact, these theatrical combats produced lasting cultural artifacts. Detailed accounts were written and circulated. Lavishly illustrated manuscripts commemorated particularly significant events, and specialized objects, from jeweled prizes to decorated weapons, preserved memories of these performances. Through these artifacts, the theatrical transformation of combat influenced broader cultural developments in literature, visual arts, and performance traditions. As the Tournament of the Golden Tree unfolded over 10 days in 1468, it demonstrated the culmination of this evolution from combat to theater. Each day featured not just physical contests, but elaborate entrances, with participants accompanied by musicians, allegorical figures, and mechanical devices. Ceremonial exchanges between challengers and defenders, and evening banquets where the day's events were celebrated through additional performances, including dances, plays, and musical compositions specifically created for the occasion. On the third day came the Lord of Ravenstein, recorded a chronicler, entering the field upon a wooden horse covered in gold cloth, accompanied by 3 giants and a dwarf who narrated his approach in verse, followed by 20 men-at-arms, dressed as Moors, carrying a great castle within which musicians played. When the castle reached the center of the field, it opened to reveal the Lord in his combat armor, ready to face the Knight of the Golden Tree. The actual combat remained central to these events, but became increasingly stylized. Specialized forms developed that maximized visual impact while controlling risk. The joust à la plaisance, with lances designed to shatter dramatically on impact. Sword combat with precisely counted blows rather than continuous fighting. And the increasingly popular combat of the barrier, where participants fought across a waist-high barrier that created distinctive technical challenges while ensuring horses could not collide. By the early 16th century, this theatrical transformation had advanced to the point where some events featured minimal actual combat, focusing instead on the pageantry surrounding it. The famous Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520, a diplomatic spectacle organized by Henry VIII of England and Francis I of France, included tournament elements but emphasized symbolic performances over genuine martial contests, with carefully choreographed encounters designed to allow both monarchs to demonstrate prowess without risking injury or embarrassment.